Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host. This time a full panel this week, and this is Buddy Sotelo calling to you from San Francisco. We've got Jonathan Schwartz all the way from Canada. We've got Mike Leno all the way from Southern California, and we've got Evan Ginsberg. And what would bring all four of us together but the death of one of the most legendary names in wrestling for a lot of people, and that is the man known as the Iron Sheik. So let's open the floor up. I think Mike's got the expiration date on, and the clock's ticking on him, so he wants to bring up his thoughts, and then it'll be the rest of us talking about Sheik's impact on professional wrestling. So go ahead, Mike. What do you have to say?
And I apologize. I'm going to have to leave it about the 20-minute mark. Losing first Billy Graham, and then if you remember, Billy Graham was, let's say, the fifth champion after Rogers, Bruno, Koloff, Morales, and then Stasiak. So anyway, and then Iron Sheik, Khosrow Vaziri after. So Billy Graham drops to Backlund. Backlund loses to Iron Sheik. Those two world champions in the span of a little over 2 weeks was kind of devastating for the industry. Evan and I are well familiar many, many times. Evan was the first guy, even before Keith Elliott Greenberg tried writing the book with Iron Sheik. Evan was down there at his place in Atlanta, and that'll allow Evan to talk about that a little bit later, because Evan's got all these experiences, as I do with Kaz. Kaz, first came to the U.S. after. He had a really impressive amateur wrestling career. Went to the Olympics, was a coach for another team, all of this that you guys can get into. And he goes to Gagne's training camp, and initially, and I'm oversimplifying things, but he was in there in that first training camp, that big one. And then when he's starting in the AWA, he was just going by the amateur wrestling good guy babyface character who happened to come from Iran, which was kind of unique, and it was different. But he wasn't quite getting over, and he also worked that gimmick. I shot him a few times in Leroy McGurk's territory. You remember Leroy McGurk ran something called Mid-Southern Wrestling, Louisiana and Oklahoma and Alabama, parts of it, etc., that Bill Watts later aggressively took over. And Bill Watts would use Iron Sheik later on once he finally turned into a Sheik-like character, but it was still Leroy McGurk's territory in that area. And he's doing that because Leroy McGurk was a good friend of Gagne's. That was the first outside the AWA territory he went to. And then he did some stuff for Ole Anderson in Georgia, but he goes to the 1976 Montreal Olympic Games with Vern and Mary Gagne, Vern's wife. And that was summer of 1976. And when they got back, he was kind of upset. Maybe Evan can go into that. He just was not getting over as a babyface and whatever. And she suggested the name Iron Sheik. Now, he wouldn't use that name until years later, but he shaves his head. So he starts getting this gimmick, the earliest ruminations of it, of this Sheik or Great Hussein Arab. And he goes to Fritz von Erich's Dallas territory. And I happened to be there 3 weeks later after he debuted as a heel, shaved head, but he had Donnelly O'Jonathan kind of mutton chop sideburns that were connected to a big mustache. And I have photos of it because he was one of the three lead heels there, even though he was kind of debuting this heel character with Apache Bull Ramus, Big John Studd, and actually 4, Ox Baker. And he would pair up, and I got him teaming with Ox Baker and Studd. Now, John Studd was wrestling under a mask, which he'd later lose to Jimmy Snuka there, who the Sheik would feud with.
That's when he was an executioner. That's when he was part of the...
No. That was later on. That was only in Tri-WF with Killer Kowalski as the mass executioners.
Oh.
He was called Captain America, an odd name for a
that's right.
in Dallas. And Sheik was being managed by Gary Hart, who was managing Big John Studd as this weird character. Why you would call a heel that Captain America, but whatever. But he ended up dropping the mess. But Kaz was wrestling against folks like undercard guys, Skip Young, and kind of a green Kevin Von Erich and folks like that there. But and then he goes from there to Mid-Atlantic and very close trans to Atlanta, and working as Hussein Arab, and they're trying out different names for him. And he, as I said, he goes to Bill Watts once he took over Leroy Burke's territory, and he works for Jarrett in Memphis and Nashville and all over there. And he was also making, with Mid-Atlantic, those trips to Toronto, to Maple Leaf Gardens, when they kind of, the Tunnies got rid of the Sheik booking all of his guys, and they oddly transed even further all these guys from the Carolinas up to, Jonathan's part of the woods in Ontario, and maybe Jonathan can talk about that. So that's a big key there for Jonathan. I don't even know why Tunnies went with Mid-Atlantic of all territories instead of something closer, maybe like Pedro Martinez in Buffalo. But that's what happens. And it wasn't until, and Evan can probably tell us, Evan, do you remember when? So he comes in to Vince Sr. as Great Hussein Arab. When was the name switch? I'm thinking if he came in like 79, it took about, was it 6 to 12 months when they finally switched the name to Iron Sheik, finally the name that Mary Gagne had come up with?
I don't remember whatsoever. All I remember is he comes at the Madison Square Garden. He wins a battle royale against some of the biggest names in history. Greg Valentine's in there, and Zbyszko and Monsoon. Basically, the whole roster, except for, of course, Backlund was not in the battle royale. And then later that night, they called him the Great Hussein Arab at that point. He wrestles Backlund because he won the battle royale, and he goes 30 minutes with Backlund, and it was like a technical masterpiece. And it was just like a star was born that night. And after that, he left soon after, and he came back, and at that point he was the Iron Sheik, if I remember correctly.
Oh, you're right. Okay, so that's what happened. Was he managed by Blassie though, as Great Hussein Arab, or no manager?
I don't remember.
I don't think he had a manager until he came back.
In his first run, he was brought. So he actually worked as Hussein Arab for a few years while he was kind of settling into his new character. He only debuted the Iron Sheik name in and around 1980, 1981 in Crockett's territory. And then they bring him back to the WWF, as it was with Ayatollah Blassie as his manager, as an absolute heat magnet, which is right on the heels of the Iranian embassy,
the hostage crisis.
And basically beats Backlund, one of the all-time best heel title victories ever, because the babyface doesn't give it up. Incredible long-term storytelling there as well, in terms of Backlund coming back ultimately as a heel and terribly embittered by his loss, and Arnold Skaaland throwing in the towel on him, and basically passes the torch to Hulk Hogan within 3 weeks.
But that was storyline, because like Bruno got to pick Koloff. Bruno did not pick Billy Graham. That was a Vince Sr. pick. But Bruno, when he told McMahon, and Bruno, Evan knows from talking to Bruno as well, the many times I did with Bruno, that's Bruno called Vince Sr. It was kind of, that was Bruno's name for him, the old man. That's what he called him. So he said that is what he told, quote unquote, the old man. He wanted his hand-picked guy, Koloff, to drop to. And Backlund wanted somebody credible, and he was fine with an amateur wrestler like Khosrow Ali Vaziri, because that's what he worked as. He used his middle name. He had several, names, a long respected name title. But Ali Vaziri was the name that he was using in the AWA, and then for Leroy McGurk in Mid-Southern before it became Mid-South. And he was feuding, of all people, the main top guy that he was feuding with for the secondary title in Fritz's territory was Jimmy Superfly Snuka. And they would have wars in Mid-Atlantic. And I know they fought, it wasn't really, it was mostly like house show stuff. It wasn't stuff that was TV fought. It wasn't a big Snuka Iron Sheik thing, because Iron Sheik was farther up on the card with Backlund by that point, etc. And then, the drop. And so there's been a lot of talk, like this heel magnet at that time, with the Iranian crisis, and the Blassie doing what Kenny Patera had put on a burnoose, as did Crusher Blackwell in the AWA, and here Blassie's doing it. So you get the greatest heel, and once you have Backlund drop to him, the greatest heel, and it's sort of a dangerous situation. People are throwing all kinds of hard objects, bottles, batteries, 9-volt batteries at Kaz. And then him dropping to Hogan, getting that whole era. The Backlund era of 5 years was gone. Now it's on to Hogan. Hogan's turn and all of that Hulkamania stuff and all that stuff that McMahon had planned with Hogan as the centerpiece, it wouldn't have been as effective without Iron Sheik. I don't think any heel could have done what Kaz did for Hogan, and that is a testament to him. And a couple of things I want to throw out before I forget is what a sweet guy he was. He was a ball to be around. He had his ups and downs with the drugs, as Keith Greenberg discussed on that A&E thing. And at the height of that, around 08 and 09, he started doing, and I was working at KYCY, that was the talk station, AM and FM in San Francisco. We got the Opie and Anthony show. I was doing PR for that show when it debuted, but Kaz was on there. And they weren't even, it bothered me. This was before he started coming on as a whack packer on the Howard Stern show. Opie and Anthony were just sort of using him. They weren't really educating their audience that, hey, this is this class amateur wrestler, and this is this mega global, or especially WWF wrestler, world champion, WWF wrestler, tag champion with Nikolai. They were just goofing on him because he was saying all of that wild and crazy stuff. Particularly about Blair. I don't know what it was about Blair trying to get behind him, and Sheik was going to humble him and blah, blah, blah. I won't repeat that out of love and respect for Khosrow, who, that's what this whole show is about, is celebrating Iron Sheik. But so they come out and they did some stuff with him, and I was there kind of keeping him calm and somebody he could talk to about wrestling, so he wouldn't be in that hyped up state. I also did that. Shuli Agar from the Stern Show hired me for the 3 West Coast swings of it was the last time all of the Howard Stern crew and their whack packers, the Beetlejuices and the Hank, the Angry Drunken Dwarf, and Wendy and the others that were not staff, but they were regulars as whack packers on the show, like Gary, well, they used to call him Gary the Retard. Fortunately, they stopped using that word and they call him Gary the Conqueror. But Iron Sheik was like lumped in with these folks. Often, most of them had mental, etc., and physical deficiencies or issues, and it was just hard. But at least Howard Stern, he got married to his second wife, and he started getting more of a heart, and he at least was alerting his audience, hey, this guy was a big wrestler before the goofing started. But it was difficult. I had to make sure he was clean, showered, got to the venue for rehearsals early, got to bed without hanging out all night, and then got to the trans to get to the next town. These are all the West Coast swing. But he was really kind of being used by the shock radio shows, and others counter it with, well, he was reaching a new audience, people that didn't know him as a wrestler. Well, it pained me to see him being goofed on, both first really awfully on the Opie and Anthony show. Ev, do you remember that time? And at least on the Howard Stern show, they were, he would say his stuff and they would present him as this guy whacked out, but it was done with some heart and less of an ugliness to it, as on the O&A show and other shock shows that were just using him. He had I won't say the guy's name, but a pretty awful manager until the Magan brothers, the twins, came in and cared for, they called him his uncle. They weren't biologically related, but very close to their father, close to them, and they kind of took over from the one guy. If you look at the Howard Stern stuff, the guy that was managing it was just another user. Unfortunately, he was out of the picture. And Jonathan, the Magan twins, I think you know them. They're out of your Ontario or Toronto area.
They are. I actually went to grade school with them. They were a year behind me.
Wow.
And I actually wrote a short piece for Slam Wrestling just this past weekend. A lot of us at Slam Wrestling have chipped in and done a series of articles about the Iron Sheik. And they absolutely loved the man, and he loved them back. And I've been in touch off and on with the Megans over the years. They're very well known within Thornhill, which is the suburb of Toronto that I'm from originally, and Toronto more broadly. Huge in the event planning scene here, also very involved in the pro wrestling scene, both here and abroad. They've promoted a number of shows here. They've worked with Impact. They've worked with AEW. I believe they've worked with WWE as well in some capacity, but not as prominently on the other stuff. They actually crowdfunded a documentary about the Iron Sheik several years back, which is very good. And, just kind of a warts and all take on the man. But it's clear in their interactions with him and everything I've ever seen from him how deep the love and respect between them was, and really still is to this day. A lot of the latter-day content that you've seen from the Iron Sheik in terms of his Twitter account, which is, was, I guess you'd say, just a laugh riot. A lot of his more recent media appearances were brokered by the Megans. And again, I tend to be of the view that what they did really successfully, despite the fact that the character became even more outsized and it became less about kind of cheap foreign menace heat and more about just this kind of bigger than life unhinged personality, was really kind of trying to reinvent him and keep him relevant for a new audience. And you have to remember too, when Sheik was on the air for Opie and Anthony and later for Howard Stern as well, this is what sold. This is what audiences were really kind of gravitating towards. One of the points I make in my piece is, rightly or wrongly, there is no part of the Iron Sheik that would fly today. The last time WWE, for example, tried it was with the Muhammad Hassan angle back in the early 2000s. And that was a disaster in terms of how it played before the public. You're really not going to see WWE do that when they go to Saudi Arabia every 6 months.
No. I've got to go soon. So I want to throw out some stuff maybe you guys can discuss. I don't even know why he started calling folks Bubba. Like Andre the Giant would call any of us that he could trust, particularly the boys, the wrestlers for the most part, calling the boss. But Sheiky, I know he called me Bubba. I know he called Evan Bubba and all of his, the people that he liked. I like the Magans got him calmed down. His wife Carol leaving him was the thing, and Evan can talk about that. Going down and working with him, trying to get the book Evan was going to do with Iron Sheik done. But he had his drug period. But the Magans calmed him down. If you look at that A&E docu,
Jonathan, we can't hear you at all, Jonathan.
Sorry.
Well,
Russell,
I've got to go.
You're engineering. We can't hear Jonathan.
I'm not the engineer here. It's Skype is the engineer. But
let me just say this before I leave, guys. The reason I'm leaving is both of these UK magazines. I'm going to pull probably 2 all-nighters. One is Inside the Ropes, and these you can actually get them at various Barnes and Nobles, but they're produced in Europe. The other is Russell Talk. Both of them are going to have my Iron Sheik cause pieces as well as Superstar Graham. It was kind of heartwarming looking all of these years, starting with I shot backstage at the 2005 Hall of Fame, where they inducted pretty much everybody from WrestleMania 1, but Billy Graham was there, and I posed him with Cause in a number of pictures, meaning Iron Sheik, as well as including Batista and Triple H and Shawn Michaels in a shot with Superstar Graham, who we just lost. 2 weeks later, Iron Sheik. And then 4 years later, at a CAC event, we have Patera. These were all good friends, Iron Sheik and Superstar Graham. They're up on stage, and Billy Graham presents Patera and Iron Sheik with on canvas acrylic paintings he'd done of both of them. And Evan can talk about that if I'm sure he saw that, because when Evan went down there to Atlanta, where Iron Sheik lived with Carol, he must have seen the Billy Graham painting, because it was quite large. It was like 2 by 3 foot on canvas. So, Eb, do you know where the Bubba thing came from, or that was just his term of endearment?
I have no idea.
That was a causism. And when you mentioned that too, or Jonathan did, we're going to miss the all caps, often out there tweets and other stuff on social media. Anytime Kaz Iron Sheik was putting himself out there, all caps, wild stuff. But I get a particular smile on my face because even when he was out of it in the the 2000s, 06 to 09 at various points, it was always Blair. And at the thing in Burbank, the Burbank airport, I think, Ev, you were there primarily. You had a booth with the other guys, Greg Valentine, Nikolai, Albano, and Kaz. But the thing that struck me, and we tried calming him down, finally got him to sit down, but he's in front of some of the cast, not the principals, not Ron Howard of American Graffiti, the movie, like Candy Clark. And I think Marjo Gortner was in another area. There was Tracy Lords, this famous actress, Leslie Ann Warren, who initially started in the 60s on Mission Impossible. And Rip Taylor standing next to Jodie Whittaker, who was in Family Affair. And they're all here. Costas got up. It was about 12 or a little before his lunchtime. And he just went in this curse-laden thing against Brian Blair going behind him and that he was going to F him and make him humble and break his back, sort of the stuff he said about Hogan, except for maybe not the F word stuff. And Ev, do you know what precipitated that? He just got up.
Yes,
and it was wild.
If you allow us to speak, we will tell the story. So we're at the Hollywood Collectors Show, and it's all these legends, and there was a silent film queen sitting there. She was like 100 years old, and we were like a square peg in a round hole. I mean, we were a bunch of wrestlers, and Seika the Porn Queen was with us, the Platinum Princess of Porn. So there we were at the Hollywood Collectors Show, kind of like what's wrong with this picture, and all of a sudden a couple of old school wrestling fans found us because we publicized, and so they're egging them on. They're like, well, what about B. Brian Blair? And all of a sudden the Sheik gets like all riled up, and he's like practically yelling, and I'm like, oh my God, because he's doing all these homophobic slurs, and half the audience was gay, and I'm like, oh my God, they're gonna throw us out of here. They're gonna throw us out of here. But he's so over the top. They didn't understand what he was saying. They had no idea.
We knew what he was talking about.
What's that?
We knew what he was talking about.
We knew what he was saying. But the non-wrestling fans are like, what's this guy yelling about? So it was actually kind of funny looking back at it. But as it was happening, I'm like, they're going to throw us out of this place, because it was a very calm setting. It was like very dignified. I mean, these were legitimate Hollywood legends that was sitting there, and the Sheik is screaming.
Oh, and Michael
York
was there too. He'd been in a million things, and Roddy McDowell as well.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, what were we doing there? It was bizarre.
Well, wait. Just for context, did these guys did this quarterly? You said at that point. I don't know if they still do the Hollywood Collectibles show, but did they always have wrestlers, or this was an unusual first time?
Oh, this what. It was a bigger deal getting Saker in, because, they were like, you have to keep it clean. Don't put any pornography out, and she's very classy. I love Saker. Yeah. She's a good friend. Yeah. So that was a bigger deal than getting the wrestlers in. But like I said, we did not really fit at the Hollywood Collectors Show. This wasn't comic book people and sports people and wrestlers. This was a different kind of convention. This was a dignified film convention. So when these fanboys riled up the Sheik, it was crazy.
What? I remember one of them brought him a beer, which we kind of kept away from him. We didn't want him getting on that. And that was Opie and Anthony, and then Stern, he would get up and say, and yell and scream this stuff. They had no idea that this was a wrestling context. He's talking about Brian Blair. He's talking about Hogan and Backlund. And we knew what he's screaming about, but none of the Opie and Anthony audience, nor the Howard Stern audience, they just thought, oh, this guy's nuts. He's yelling and screaming. We love this. But, it just detracted from, and I felt like he was being used. It detracted from his career, and most notably his amateur stuff and all of the things he did to get out of and escape Iran, where he felt like he might have been, killed possibly. He had to get out of there, and there was a lot of courage that you guys can talk about. So I'm going to bid you guys adieu. I'm sorry to have blabbed so much, but you guys have a great rest of the show. God bless. We all love Khosrow Vaziri, Ali Vaziri, Iron Sheik. He was one of a kind. We won't see his likes again, and he was really a sweet guy. Evan and I loved him. We knew him. We loved him. Anybody that knew him at all, had any interaction, very kind, great guy, and great wrestler, as Evan and you guys can probably talk about. Good night, everybody.
Okay, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Okay.
So we can now talk. John,
we're allowed to speak now.
You're still with us.
So the Sheik's quote-unquote agent at the time, Johnny Valiant referred to him as Tony Tickets because he was a ticket broker, prior to getting involved in wrestling. So he says to me, Evan, I'm going to fly you out. This is the suburb right outside of Atlanta. The Sheik lived. He lived in the same area as Orndorff, Abdullah the Butcher, Evander Holyfield. So he flies me out. He transes me in, and he's like, "Don't worry, we'll take care of you. We're going to spend a weekend at the Sheik's house." And I go down there, and I have a piece coming out on Pro Wrestling Stories, which will really go into detail. It was a pretty intense weekend, and to break it down, he was basically just talking like in a loop. It was like a record skipping. That jabroni rock star Hulk Hogan, Vern Gagne, told me to break his leg. He'd give me $100,000. Sheik wouldn't do it. I put him over. He wouldn't bring me into WCW. Basically, whatever the question I asked him for this proposed book, that was the answer. It was like a loop, And I'm on the plane going back. We were there from just Friday night to Sunday night. And I said to Tony, we're not getting a book out of this guy. I said, that's not a book. He's basically cutting the same promo over and over and over again. He was not in good shape at that time. And, his daughter had been murdered not all that long before. And, he still had his personal issues, drug issues. So it was basically a failed weekend. And years later, Keith Elliott Greenberg did quote unquote finish the book, and WWE put it on the shelf. They basically said to him, the stories are like too wild. We're a PG company. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, and and that book didn't come out. So basically, the project has been cursed. But like Mike said, and Jonathan said, that documentary did come out and portrayed him in a positive light. And but as far as wrestling, that guy in his prime was magnificent. I saw him in 2 boot camp matches against Sergeant Slaughter. Everybody talks about him beating Backlund and losing to Hogan. His great matches were those boot camp matches with Slaughter.
That was something I was going to bring up. The Sergeant Slaughter Iron Sheik feud for a while, I think, was bigger than anything Hulk Hogan was involved in.
Those matches were some of the greatest matches I ever saw. I I saw it twice, once at the Garden, and I believe the other one was at the Meadowlands. And it was unbelievable, just unbelievable. It was brutal.
Okay, I'm sorry, but Jonathan, you're going to say something?
No, I was going to say, wasn't Sheik instrumental in Slaughter turning face? Because I remember, for example, that earlier series of boot camp matches where you had Slaughter against Pat Patterson, and Patterson was basically turned face by Sergeant Slaughter at that point. So around the time of WWF's national expansion, you had Hogan positioned supposed to be the number one babyface in the company, and Slaughter early on was at least number two, and there was always some discussion about whether Slaughter was actually more popular than Hulk Hogan at that point.
Well, Jimmy Snuka was the top baby face for the most part after Backlund.
And also Tito Santana was rising a lot during that time.
And they brought in Junkyard Dog as well, but who probably would have gone even higher if it hadn't been for his own substance abuse issues.
They brought Junkyard Dog in to tag with Sergeant Slaughter against Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik, and that's the first live WWF match that I went to go see. Was the Sergeant Slaughter debut of Junkyard Dog, at least in San Francisco. He probably was on the card before that, but it's the first time Junkyard Dog had been able to perform in the Bay Area, because he had been so centered in the South all that time. He'd never come to the Bay Area before, but he was, pretty big legend at that stage, at least from the Mid-South area. And I'd read a lot about him and all that stuff. And then he was put in a tag team with Sergeant Slaughter. And the other Sergeant Slaughter Iron Sheik boot camp match that I wanted to see was actually sold out. I actually could not get tickets to go to that match. So I was really bummed about it. And so because I couldn't go, they put on the tag match with Sergeant Slaughter and Junkyard Dog versus Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik. I want to say that the pop from that crowd when Sergeant Slaughter and JYD came in, first of all, the boos for the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov were that's about as rabid a crowd I've personally seen. Was that, because we're talking like 84 here. We're talking like the jingoistic height of the Reagan era was happening right there, and how much people hated both Russians and Iranians at the same time. And Nikolai Volkov would stop everyone and do the Russian national anthem, and just you couldn't hear and he had a loud voice, man. You knew better than anybody, Evan, about what kind of a loud voice Nikolai Volkov had. It was just, you couldn't hear a thing because the crowd was going so much, and then it exploded when Sergeant Slaughter came in. Iron Sheik was such a big part of that and generating that heat that I'm not sure he'll ever get the full credit by modern society about what an instrument he was to make that whole USA WWE thing, WWF thing, all happen in that mid to late 80s time frame.
You see, it's a shame. It's a shame, all that Opie and Anthony and Howard Stern stuff, because the younger fans are going to remember him more as a character as opposed to a tremendous athlete. I saw him from 79 to 84, 85, and that guy was magnificent. And a lot of people
call him the king of suplexes.
Oh my God. I saw like I said, Sheik and Slaughter in those boot camp matches. I'm going to wrestling since 1974, almost 50 years. Those were among the greatest matches I've ever seen, And I'm jaded, and I'm saying this, and I'm not just saying it because this is a tribute to him. So I hope that the fans get past I'm going to humble him and blah, 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 and actually watch some of those great, great matches he had. I saw at the Garden, they had, as Russell was saying, they had JYD and Snuka against No, I'm getting my matches mixed up because this is 40 years ago against Piper and Orton. That was a kick-ass match. But when Nikolai and Iron Sheik teamed at the Garden, boy, it was just the heat was off the charts. And the irony of it, Nikolai was a dear friend of mine, and he was like the sweetest person in the world. Bret Hart, after Nikolai died, Bret Hart said that Nikolai Volkov was the nicest wrestler he ever met. And Bret Hart worked with everybody. So I'm not just, you know, and they were like the odd couple. They were like the odd couple because Nikolai was squeaky clean and, you know.
Very frugal on the road, too.
Yeah.
Which is something that Sheik often commented about in pretty colorful terms, too.
Yeah.
Like Nikolai, the story that I'd always heard, and you would know better than I would, is that Nikolai basically saved at least half of every penny he ever earned on the road. And one of the ways that he would do that is he wouldn't go head out to Waffle House or wherever the wrestlers went after the matches to fill up. He traveled with a hot plate and he would cook food in his room to save money and to make sure that he ate well.
But also, he was a health nut, so he was watching what he ate, and
Sheik, pardon my using the term, but the Iron Sheik would occasionally accuse him of being a cheap Jew, in so many words. But I think the thing to kind of remember when he would use that language, which would not fly now, and certainly not among the three of us, is that he had a very kind of different understanding of it in a weird way, and it was meant affectionately. I don't know that somebody outside of it would take it as such, but it wasn't meant as a slight.
When I was at Sheik's house, I heard that, and I'm Jewish, and I was not offended because I don't think he was a mean-spirited guy. I just don't think it was intended, you know, as a slur. Even with the I'm going to humble you, you know, that kind of, you know, I don't think it was intended as any kind of slur. I mean,
it was the character.
And he was a living stereotype. I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, from the moment he debuted as the Iron Sheik, people were just programmed to hate him because of all that. And that's what made him who he was. And back then, too, the way that wrestlers kidded with each other. You know, you had guys like wrapping themselves in the stars and bars, right? I mean, like the fabulous Freebirds. You know, they had the Confederate flag on them all the time. You know, you had guys like Baron von Raschke who marched around with a Nazi flag. You know, obviously things that just the level of, you know, you had redneck Dick Murdoch, who was actually, I think, a card-carrying KKK member. So you have situations where these guys were much less sensitive. The political correctness. I mean, calling someone a cheap Jew was like, you know, the least of it. I mean, probably what Ivan Putski was called and what Tito Santana was called in the locker room probably would, you know, make a lot of people, you know, modern cancel culturists would faint at the idea.
But I don't want to leave the listeners with the idea that Nikolai was not a decent person, because he watched his money, but he was also very kind and giving. And I had nights where we were producing Johnny Valiant's one-man show, and once or twice Johnny had emergencies, and Nikolai would just drive down from Baltimore and sub for us for chump change, you know, because he was such a generous, kind, giving person. So I don't want to leave the viewers.
Oh, and sorry, I wasn't trying to imply anything negative about Nikolai or Sheik for that matter. I actually think that given all of the horror stories you hear about how people end up out of pro wrestling, the fact that Nikolai was so careful on so many fronts, I think is actually a really good thing.
Nikolai.
They said the same thing about Randy Savage too. We just lost superstar Billy Graham, for example, and unfortunately, there's still a GoFundMe out there in order to cover off his medical bills and his final expenses, which is an absolute tragedy.
It's an atrocity. It's an atrocity that the money these guys generated, and they were never paid what they were worth, to have to do a GoFundMe to be buried or to pay medical expenses. The same thing with Bushwhacker Butch, who needed a GoFundMe to be buried. It's absolutely disgraceful. They have pay-per-views generating millions of dollars, or whatever they call it now. They don't call it pay-per-views anymore. Generates millions of dollars, these events.
Premier viewing event. It's a premier viewing event.
Premier waste of 3 hours for the
Thank you. Yes.
But Triple H comes out and boasts about the record-breaking ticket sales because they jacked the prices up obscenely, and the record-breaking merchandise sales. How about taking a fraction of 1% of the money that WWE generates and do like the NFL does and take care of your pioneers and legends so they don't have to
be buried in a cardboard box.
Oh my God, how disgraceful. People defend these guys. It's like, they all do it. No, not every corporation is ruthless. Okay, not every corporation. So
went to the Sheik's house. I mean, he didn't live like a total super millionaire or anything.
The Sheik's house was a modest, well-kept. It was a nice house. It was far from a mansion. It was a nice suburban house, like you would see in any, outside of any major city. It was like 20 minutes outside of Atlanta. I believe it was Fayetteville. This is going back 20 years. So, but no, the house itself was attractive and well kept and modest. I mean, but it was nice. It wasn't like he was living in a shack by any means, but I do know WWE legends that were, living in a boarding house and basically broke. And a lot of these legends before the Hogan boom period, these guys never broke $100,000 a year, and they were on the road 300 plus days a year, and
350 days.
Well, it's funny you say that because just the other day, Ric Flair said that him and Bret Hart were on the road 350 days, and
do you get royalties?
Yeah.
But Bret Hart said to the crew. He said 330 days. Greg Valentine said 320 days. So Flair was on the road 350 days as NWA champion. So none of this is exaggerated. I mean, this is basically, so imagine the expenses involved, 3 meals a day and getting from place to place and sending money back to your family and to your ex-wife and your ex-ex-wife and your ex-ex-ex-wife because you were on the road 300 plus days a year. It was a brutal existence. And,
to make things even more brutal for the Iron Sheik, that was the loss of his daughter, the murder.
Yeah, she was murdered, and it was, devastating. He walked into the house. Never forget it. There's a big framed picture of his daughter who was young and beautiful. And he just started crying. I mean, that's how deep the wound was, And it was really sad, very sad. And, so this guy was not the cartoon, character that he's portrayed as because of, the Howard Stern show and such. Nicole Bass was a dear friend of mine, and I was literally at her deathbed The night before they pulled the plug on her, I was at the hospital with her. And she said to me, she said, quote, "I love Howard, but sometimes it really hurt her that, people laughed at her. You look like a guy, you look like Herman Munster." It really hurt her because, she would put on makeup and do her hair and look pretty. And, she appreciated, "You look nice tonight, Nicole. You look pretty. You look beautiful." And she, it's a shame that the stereotype, the caricature of these people becomes, the way people think of them, because the Iron Sheik's daughter was murdered. How does that affect anybody? Anybody? It's going, So I saw, I'm not going to. I was friends with Nikolai. The Sheik was more of an acquaintance. I'm not going to exaggerate the relationship, but we were on the road together, and I never saw him say no for an autograph, a picture. Very fan friendly, very gracious. The wrestlers loved him. He was very supportive of the other wrestlers. He gave them advice. Not everybody does. He was a beloved elder, and an elder in the wrestling community, and a good-hearted guy, warm guy. I'll never forget these words. I'm sitting in his living room. He says to me, "Mr. Evan, would you like a cookie?" Would you like a cookie? This is a guy who could kill me with his bare hands. He's just a warm, giving guy, and I just
another subject I was going to bring up, though, in the history of the Iron Sheik and where he became kind of a focus of a crossroads in wrestling was when he got arrested with a hacksaw Jim Duggan driving up the California freeway, and he was smoking weed along with hacksaw Jim Duggan, and they got busted. And that was, to me, one of the first real hard to explain moments that really destroyed kayfabe by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, not that people were huge, believers in all things kayfabe, but when, my friends at school found out that hacksaw Jim Duggan got busted smoking weed with the Iron Sheik, it really made that argument that this isn't just a choreographed performance and it's all quote unquote fake hard to argue. And for a guy as iconic as the Iron Sheik was as a character, it made that situation where he got busted with hacksaw Jim Duggan, I think, kind of as, a critical part of wrestling history for the death of kayfabe. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and also McMahon publicly said it's a work so he could save the money, in New Jersey, at the arenas. So yeah. That same era, it was, the cat was out of the bag. In the NWA, the faces and heels, didn't really travel together, and even
Bill Watts would not have been happy with that.
Oh yeah.
I'm just going to say Hacksaw and the Sheik walked so that 30 years later, Rob Van Dam and Sabu could fly.
Yeah. Yes, I guess that's true. Nowadays something like that happens and no one would care. Although for a long time, marijuana was used as part of the wellness policy to really come down on people that Vince didn't like with, some sort of, reasoning behind why he would be able to suspend them or cancel their contracts or just, no longer bring them in or use them in story angles or whatever, and now, I mean, what Hacksaw and Iron Sheik, of course, getting caught while smoking while driving isn't a good thing either. It's a DUI, any way you look at it. But the severity of it, I think, would be laughed off in today's modern world, and instead, it was a big thing. I remember at the time it being a very big issue for wrestling fans.
Oh, it hit all the major media. Yeah,
I was going to say it was a legitimate news story. I mean, what papers up here covered it?
Yeah.
If my memory serves, and again, we forget how long ago all these things were. I believe there were other substances in the car too, if I'm correct, if memory serves. Right, Jonathan?
Yes. So there were open alcohol container violation. Duggan was caught with marijuana in the system. Sheik unfortunately was caught with marijuana and cocaine, and there was cocaine residue in the car.
Wow, you have a better memory than me, but I'm much older. So yeah.
I do my homework.
By the way, I'd like to acknowledge that Jonathan and Dr. Mike have the very same background. So now that they're roommates, they could like talk wrestling all day and night. It was. Did you realize you had the same backdrop as Mike?
Oh, he's just down the hall.
Yeah, yeah.
But so Jonathan, it's interesting how like hated was the Iron Sheik in Canada, because obviously the U.S. had everything going on with
every bit as much here as he was there. Just as a footnote too, before he was the Iron Sheik, when he was still working as Hussein Arab, he was the NWA Canadian Heavyweight Champion on two occasions.
Oh yeah,
and he beat. I'm probably going to mess up my timelines here, but he beat Angelo Mosca, who was who worked face here sometimes as well, as a local guy, and he beat Dino Bravo, I think.
Wow.
And this is back when Dino Bravo was a very popular wrestler coming in from Quebec.
No, I mean in the earlier days, especially before he had his back injury, which really put him out and made him much more of a jobber. Sorry to put that, but he was definitely losing a lot more matches than he won in his Colonel Mustafa days. When he would come back with Sergeant Slaughter in that early '90s period. He was just really, that back of his just had totally given out. But before that, you would see Iron Sheik do all sorts of moves. Like, as I said, his nickname was King of the Suplex. And you would always see him do gut wrenches, butterfly suplexes, saltoses, back body drops. That was one of his big things. And of course, the gimmick that I love so much, and I would be replete if I didn't mention it now, which is the loaded boot. How awesome was the loaded boot? And something that absolutely isn't done today in today's wrestling.
And the clubs were great.
The workout clubs, yes, which I heard were legitimately, like 100 pounds, and almost impossible for anyone else to wield them the way that they.
Backlund was the only guy that could legitimately do it. They brought all these big muscle guys out, and they couldn't do it. I think they were 75 pounds each, if I remember.
Yeah. They were significant. So anyway, so what would be your favorite? I mean, we know that your favorite match was the boot camp match against the Iron Sheik.
Also that 1979 title match with Backlund after he won the Battle Royale, that was 30 minutes. That was one of Backlund's greatest matches. I mean, they just went back and forth. And I'm talking wrestling. I'm not talking, I'm not talking just the crazy brawl. These guys were wrestling. I'm talking like Kurt Angle-like wrestling. And the Sheik was tremendous in his prime.
Well, that was
years after the fact, I saw Slaughter and Sheik on an indie, and they had both lost a lot. Maybe early '90s or whatever. But when in his prime, that guy was great.
I think one of the really great things about the Sheik was that in his prime, he could go. And he had that really great balance between that kind of absolutely bloodthirsty, cheating heel, and he was a technical wizard as well.
Yeah.
So, it's going to sound silly, but we talk about his best appearances. I would argue that there was never any better heel at working with enhancement talent than the Sheik. If you remember, like early WWF Superstars broadcast, and he'd be in against some hapless guy who looked like he walked in off the street, and it would be the same thing as an original Sheik match. And Iron Sheik was candid that his gimmick was largely lifted, at least at the beginning, from the original Sheik. And complete with he'd tear off the keffiyeh and he'd tear off his robes and he'd start strangling his opponent with them immediately and he'd start beating him down mercilessly. And then midway through the match, it would switch to this virtuosic technical performance where he'd start suplexing the guy halfway across the ring. And what he did really well is he knew how to build a match. And he knew how to build to his finisher as well, which you don't really see very much these days. And, it's one thing that I'll say, even if you look at people who we talk about how great they are in ring, when I watch a lot of matches, there's often kind of a discrepancy between how a match is built and how it ends. So you look at, say, and I'm not picking on him, but Arn Anderson, for example, one of the best ever in terms of picking on a body part, usually left arm, and he'd work it over the entire match.
Kowalski also, he worked body parts. Yeah.
But Anderson, he'd finish his opponent with a spine buster or a DDT, which has nothing to do with the body part that he's been weakening the entire match. Flair was good at it too, that he'd start picking apart his opponent's leg before going for the figure four. Iron Sheik, you'd have a solid 5 minutes of suplexes and kicks to the back and knees and loaded boots and all of it, and it built up the camel clutch as an incredibly painful hold. And speaking as an older brother who would practice submission wrestling on his younger brother, complete with horrifically inappropriate promos to go with it.
Yeah.
That was a move that seemed like it really worked. And it's one of those moves to this day I can't figure out how you would get it on your opponent without actually hurting them. And I think that was, I know we've been critical about the Howard Stern stuff as well, but I had a chance to go back and forth with the Megans recently after Sheik's passing, and I got to tell you, what he really brought, and I think this is important for those of us who really follow wrestling, is unless you really got to peek behind the curtain, as Evan has and as Mike has, for example, you never knew where the character stopped and the real person began. As somebody who's a step or two removed, and I've said this to Evan before about Nikolai as well, it surprises me to hear how wonderful they were in their personal lives, what sweet gentlemen they actually were, because they were so good at being bloodthirsty and awful in public. And you'd think if anybody had license to be a jerk outside of the ring, it would be people like that who spent their whole careers basically striving to be hated.
Well,
and they're the nicest guys ever.
Yeah, what I found interesting as a kid, we'd wait outside Madison Square Garden with my dad, and we'd meet the wrestlers. And it's like, talk about being smartened up. There's George Steele, friendly, signing autographs, talking, perfectly intelligent, instead of, playing this, strange character. And Billy Graham couldn't be any nicer, and, et cetera, so on. The Grand Wizard, Albano couldn't be any nicer. And there's Dusty and Andre, they won't sign to anybody. They don't even look at you like you're beneath them. And you just sit, you're a kid, and you're trying to figure it all out because you're a mark and you believe in all this, and you're like, wait a second. Bad guys are nice, and some of the nice guys aren't nice, and it blows your mind as a kid. So,
I think for people like us who kind of stuck with being fans into adulthood, one of the coolest things is at some point you realize that evil is seductive, and it becomes more fun to cheer for the bad guys than it does to cheer for the good guys.
Buddy Sotelo lived off of that. That's that's how Buddy Sotelo came into existence.
and I think one more thing about Sheik that I think is,
as a culture, we began to embrace the anti-hero, from the Clint Eastwood stuff, and guys that would do whatever it takes to get a win. there are people who start sympathizing with that, and it's something that means something to them. Even, to this day, I think a little bit of those Trump supporters have that same mentality in them, that they want someone that never will say that they're wrong, or they could ever give up, or that they could ever be defeated, even when they are defeated. There's people who admire that.
Oh, Trump is entirely a product of pro wrestling.
Yeah,
but
or
like his whole thing, like from the whole package from day one is absolutely. If Vince wasn't working for him behind the scenes from the very beginning, I actually wouldn't be surprised, because it's that stage managed with him.
Well,
and he knows his audience, and
look at
that's
who he
the audience
appointed as the Small Business Administration, head of the Small Business Administration. You just have to look no further from that, and know that there's certainly ties there that go a lot deeper than just the surface. But that would be a subject for another show. So anyway, yeah, I mean, with the death of the Iron Sheik, in a lot of ways, an era has ended. I mean, sure, there are guys that still wrestle that, use character gimmicks and stuff like that. But somebody that so embodied their gimmick that really you couldn't easily separate at all who he was in the ring from when he was outside the ring. I mean, he was who he was as the Iron Sheik. I mean, what did he be noticed as anything else?
And the other thing to bear in mind, too, is he was an absolute unreconstructed bad guy. I mean, you can talk about guys like Jake Roberts or The Undertaker or Steve Austin, who've come along since, who were brought in as heels, and eventually the crowd turned them face. There is no way that you could turn an Ivan Koloff or a Nikolai Volkov or an Iron Sheik face.
Nikolai Volkov wouldn't face.
They did, but the way that they turned him face
was
once the Soviet Union fell, and they had this whole glasnost perestroika gimmick with him. So he basically, in order to turn face, had to repudiate the whole Soviet bad guy thing. You couldn't do that with the Iron Sheik, at least not credibly.
No. And not until America gets along well with the Iraq.
NWA run, they did the same thing, but by that point he was also kind of, ready to move on to his career post wrestling as well. Let's say.
Yeah, once America gets along well with the Middle East, maybe, but now it's a little bit too late. So, and we haven't even talked about the Live tournament, so that's a completely different subject for another time. But it's great to have you guys on. Some really great memories. And some great thoughts, Jonathan. And I like how we talked about the philosophy behind heels. I always get interested in that part of discussing wrestling, the what makes things a heel and how people react to that is always, the psychological element is always interesting to me.
You also have to understand that this was a long time ago. It was a different era. A lot of the fans were marks. They weren't smartened up. There was no internet, So I was talking to somebody about the German heels. In the 70s, we had Waldo von Erich and Otto von Helle and Baron von Raschke and Hans Schroeder, all in WWF. That's the 70s. A lot of the adults sitting in that crowd fought in World War II. They fought against the Nazis. And so this is really striking close to home. So then you go into the 80s and you have, the politics of that era. And the Sheik was the perfect guy at the perfect time. And don't forget, with Nikolai, you had the Cold War. Every James Bond movie, he's fighting the Russians. Okay? You were in the middle of the Cold War. So add the real politics with the fact that a big chunk of the audience were marks or suspension of disbelief while they were watching it. And it worked. They hated these guys. Nikolai said to me, he said, Evan, in the middle of the garden cards, they would put me and Sheik in an ambulance and sneak us out of the garden because the fans after the show would have murdered us. Okay, that's the heat these guys got. Today it's like we laugh and MJF is funny. it's a different mindset. Back then, you know, I had friends who would go to Puerto Rico. If they were heels, you can't imagine what the fans did to them. They'd be throwing piss at them and batteries. Crazy. I could do a whole show on old school wrestlers who were stabbed mid-ring, mid-match.
Oh, Roddy Piper was stabbed by fans.
Blackjack Mulligan was stabbed so badly he was out for months.
Fred Blassie too.
Blassie had acid thrown in his face. Acid.
In fairness, he did cause heart attacks in Japan.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, you know, once again, I'll throw this out there. I know Russell wants to wrap up. I'll just say very quickly, you know, people tend to like laugh at all of this. It's, oh, that guy was a great heel and he was a character and he was over the top. But it was dangerous back then. It was legitimately dangerous for these guys. These guys would come out and their tires were slashed and people were attacking their cars. And, you know, they were scared. They were scared. Johnny Valiant used to say to me, you know, I was not a barroom brawler. I never got into a fight with a single fan. I'm not a tough guy. You know, you forget they're big burly guys. Even Johnny was a legit 240. You know, but he's like, I'm not looking to fight anybody in a bar. And, you know, brother, you know, he would just calm the situation down, you know. So the Iron Sheik, you know, he was kind of on edge because it was dangerous out there for him mid-'80s. Dangerous.
True. It's true.
And interesting that, and I guess we might want to close with this. I also think it's worth noting that Sheik and Nikolai, for that matter, given that both of them portrayed characters as representing regimes that they fled, basically, once they got to the U.S. and established themselves and lived there, both of them were incredibly patriotic in their private lives. And I remember the story particularly about Nikolai that he'd had with Blassie when they were basically turning Nikolai from a Mongol to a Russian. And he voiced his concern about it because Nikolai was actually Croatian, I believe. And they'd been overtaken by the Soviets. And he hated the Soviets for obvious reasons. And Blassie basically told him to justify this character that he'd be playing now and singing the Russian national anthem and waving the flag and all the rest of it, that this is how you teach people about how evil that regime is.
And Nikolai versus Bruno in the 70s was a big deal. Those guys were arch rivals. This guy was taken very seriously as a heel. You know, they literally had Nikolai and Sheik in cartoons later. Mm-hmm. But in the 70s, when, you know, Nikolai came out to wrestle Bruno at the Garden, it was serious. You know, the guy was a powerhouse. He used to come on TV and squeeze fruit and it would explode. That's how strong this guy was. I'll tell you the last thing before we go, because I know Russell wants to go. Nikolai.
Good stuff. Don't worry, I'll edit out some of Mike's stuff. I'll cut out some of Mike's stuff.
Nikolai would always ask me to room with him because he was worried the Sheik would be partying. So one day Nikolai wakes up and we're in this hotel. He takes out these old school blocks from the old country. He's doing hundreds of push-ups. And then he goes, Evan, let's arm wrestle. Okay. So I'm like, okay. So I'm 6'2", 220. I'm not a 98-pound weakling. I could not move this guy's arm 1 inch. That's how strong this guy was. Not 1 inch. I'll never forget it. And I love Nikolai. Like I said, I was not as close with the Iron Sheik, but he was a good-hearted guy. And, you know, R.I.P., you know. You'll never find another guy like the Iron Sheik. What a unique character. And a good person. Good person.
I love having you on the show, Evan. I'm sorry every time we have to have you on, it's because somebody that we loved died, some legend that we, you know, loved, happens to pass away during the week. And
what's the percentage of shows you've done where somebody died? It has to be at least a third.
I'm thinking it's more like about 50%, to be honest.
Yeah,
with you.
man, it's unbelievable.
Sad. It's really sad stuff. But it's good to have you here. Great to have your insight. A really nice show tonight, and we'll have you on again sometime, especially when you're ready to promote your book.
Check out Wrestling Then and Now. It's on Tubi and Plex. Nikolai's in it. Yeah.
Jonathan, your plug?
SlimeWrestling.net. My last column came out last week, and I've got another one coming out this coming week, looking at what's going to happen with AEW Collision.
Great. Thanks for being on the show this week, guys. It was a great show. See you all again soon. Good night, everyone.
Bye.